Rebecca is a current KUASIA visiting scholar and a final year PhD candidate at the University of Leeds in the UK, where she's completing a project on Facebook-mediated expressions of Thai identities within the perspective of social semiotic multimodality. At Leeds, Rebecca has taught undergraduate Thai language and digital communications modules. She was a scholar in residence at the Library of Congress in the United States in 2019 and held research affiliations with Silpakorn University, Thailand in 2016 and 2018. In the current academic year, she's a visiting researcher at Koç University Center for Asian Studies. So welcome, Rebecca. Today's, the title of Rebecca's talk today is Undoing Thainess Online, Contemporary Patani-Thai Identity as Multimodally Reconstructed on Facebook. So Rebecca, floor is yours.
Thank you. Hello. Yep, the title of my talk today, Undoing Thainess Online, Contemporary Patani-Thai Identity as Multimodally Reconstructed on Facebook. I will just begin by giving an introduction to myself. So the research that I am starting at as a KUASIA visiting scholar is separate to the research that I am presenting today, but it borrows the same methodology. And I will discuss my KUASIA project very briefly at the end. I talk about my methodology in some detail today. So at the end, I will tie that to the KUASIA research project that I've started as a visiting scholar here. Today, I'll be introducing my PhD research. It investigates how 6 different Thai Facebook pages are intervening in the multimodal reconstruction and deconstruction of the nationalizing identity discourse known in the Thai context as Quan Ben Thai, which literally translates as Thainess. So rather than introducing content from all 6 Facebook pages that I investigate in my PhD project today, I will be focusing on the practices of Wartani. Wartani is an independent media page representing the southern Patani-Thai community. Okay, I'll start with the question, what is Thainess? Quan Ben Thai. What is Quan Ben Thai? So, Thainess is a discursive construct. I'll begin by outlining how discourse is understood within the bounds of my PhD work. Discourses are ways of constituting certain knowledges about some aspect of reality that are both socially influenced and influence society. Discourses are given representation through communication, such as face-to-face conversations, speeches, YouTube videos, and for my project, the production and publication of Facebook posts. And in my research, the discourse being investigated is Thainess, institutionally constituted knowledge pertaining to what it does or does not mean to be a citizen of the Thai nation. I will just read a quote now from 2 of the main scholars from the tradition of critical discourse analysis. I've given the reference to this this work at the end of the presentation. Fairclough and Wodak in 1997 write of discourse that it is socially constitutive as well as socially conditioned. It constitutes situations, objects of knowledge, and the social identities of and relationships between people and groups of people. It is constitutive both in the sense that it helps to sustain and reproduce the social status quo and in the sense that it contributes to transforming it, unquote. And another useful quote from Theo van Leuven this time. Theo van Leuven is one of the founders of the field of social semiotics and multimodality. And for van Leuven and his colleague Kress, discourses are problematic because of their ideological underpinnings. Van Leuven writes, knowledge is selective, and what it selects depends on the interests and purposes of the institutions that have fostered the knowledge. Actual instantiations of discourse draw only on parts of the knowledge, unquote. So in this regard, I, in my research, understand the discourse of Thainess, so the textually realized knowledge of what it means to be a Thai citizen, to draw upon only some of the knowledge pertaining to what it means or not to be a Thai citizen. And this is because not everyone has a say, or at least not as well disseminated or equal a say in the discursive construction of Thainess. Thainess is constantly being reformulated, so different parts of the knowledge are drawn upon to suit the different needs of different actors at different times. Thongchai Winichagun, who is a very important figure in Thailand, a Thai historian, and in his seminal 1994 work, Siam Mapped, he writes about Thainess that the definition of Thainess has never been and never will be clear. Therefore, the domain of what is Thainess and the power relations arising from it constitute an arena over which different interpretations from various positions struggle to gain hegemony. So despite this ambiguity over the details and the particularities of Thainess, which are constantly changing in line with the interests of changing regimes, despite that ambiguity over details, Thongchai continues that the themes of Thainess are clear. The themes of Thainess are clear. What is right and wrong for Thai people, how they should behave, and how to think on every issue, unquote. And finally, Thongchai writes that whenever subversions of the incumbent norms of Thainess are set forth, these challenge the official view only in order to propose yet another standard of Thainess, unquote. So in my work, I refer to this kind of normative Thainess that is shifting, it's constantly shifting in shape, but it's always, whenever changes occur, it's only to propose another standard, another norm. So I refer to this kind of normative Thainess, which changes in line with the varying political power struggles in Thailand in a way that represents the interests of the Thai elite, but never the Thai citizens, as institutional Thainess in my research. So one of the most stable formulations of institutional Thainess revolves around the three pillars of nation, religion, and king. So despite the varying details, which as Thongchai has noted, are hard to define, the particulars are hard to define, despite those varying details of Thainess, the ideal Thai citizen is always projected as being loyal to the Thai nation, the Buddhist religion, and the Thai king. So if you ask a Thai citizen, what does Thainess mean? Often the reply would be Chad, Satsana, Prat Mahagasat. So Satsana means religion, but it's not general religion, it's implying the Buddhist religion. And as Ariana notes, these three pillars have been mainstays of institutional Thainess since the reign of Rama VI, that is King Wajirawut, in the early 20th century. Ariana writes, King Rama VI deployed media and the arts to establish three pillars of Thai identity or Thainess that still define the country today: nation, religion, and king. So this is what Thainess as discourse, specifically institutional Thainess as discourse, is understood to mean, to be about within the bounds of my research. It's how I'm framing it. And as is implied by the title of my talk, I am suggesting that discourse can be multimodally de- and reconstructed. So what does it mean to say a discourse like institutional Thainess can be multimodally de- or reconstructed? When analysing discourse from a multimodal perspective, the concept of mode, which is also sometimes called a semiotic resource. So in the literature, in social semiotics, multimodality, you may see the terms mode and semiotic resource being used rather interchangeably. The concept of mode is used to refer to socially and culturally shaped resources for making meaning. That's a quote from the Mode online glossary of multimodal terms. It can be found online. I reference it at the end of my presentation. So, for example, speech is its own mode, writing its own mode, color its own mode, gesture its own mode, so pointing, shaking my head, different culturally specific gestures, so the Y in Thailand as a formal greeting, these are that gesture, shaking the head, gaze, proximity, how close I stand to someone when I'm talking to them. If I'm quite close to them, it could signal my comfort with that person, which would maybe imply a close social relationship to them. If I'm standing at a distance, perhaps I'm trying to be more formal with that person. So again, it comes back to what social relations are at play, what power hierarchies are at play. So the Mode glossary of multimodal terms continues, embracing a variety of communicational means as worthy of investigation constitutes a challenge to the prior predominance of spoken and written language in academic work, and opens up possibilities for recognizing, analyzing, and theorizing the variety of ways in which people make meaning and how those meanings are multimodally interrelated. So typically there has been primacy given to the linguistic mode, and this is an issue in critical discourse analysis as well. There is a kind of mission and a project to denaturalize discourses in critical discourse analysis, and kind of peel back layers to see what ideological underpinnings are kind of at play. However, by only giving primacy to the linguistic mode, you can only go so far in that mission to kind of denaturalize a discourse if you're not looking at other modes. So this is where Theo van Leuven and Gunther Kress came into, kind of intervened in critical discourse analysis by establishing the importance of understanding communication as something that is always happening multimodally. Okay, so simply put, modes are resources for making meaning, and that's why they're also known as semiotic resources, semiotic meaning-making resources. Discursive construction happens multimodally, not just in the linguistic mode. So just as a very brief kind of demonstration, this image here, it's from, oh, excuse me. It's an image taken from some of my Facebook data that I collected from the 6 groups that six Facebook pages that I investigate in my research. Just a very kind of brief introduction to what how a multimodal analyst would approach such an image. Of course, we see an image, but we would query, is it a photograph? Is it an illustration? Is there a combination of the photographic mode with graphical elements, which there is here? There's a photograph of the male participant, who is the Thai Prime Minister Prayut, but also a graphical element on the left, the Thai flag. What colors are deployed? So we see the tricolor Thai flag here, and then quite a mild background to the image, and then quite significantly, Prayut's suit is a similar color to the blue band of the Thai flag, so it's complementing the Thai flag. It's not some bright colored suit that is really making him stand out apart from the colors of the Thai flag. Gesture, so he's making a kind of hushing gesture in the image. We would query, the multimodal analyst would query, who is being hushed? Now, thinking about gaze as a mode in its own right and gesture as a mode in its own right, the intermodal relation between gesture and gaze here is interesting and significant, because if he was looking directly at the lens, it would feel like the hushing gesture is made at us, the audience to the image, the viewer of the image, but his gaze is actually off lens. So it seems directed to maybe a specific person that we can't see, we don't have actual knowledge of, or people. Clothing, so I've mentioned the significance of the color of his suit, and also the fact he's wearing a suit, which is, it's formal, but it's also not traditional Thai clothing. And actually there has been a trend in Thai politics of late for politicians to start wearing more traditional Thai clothing and in appeal to the Thai masses. So while he seems dressed, perhaps for a Western viewer, dressed in a very formal and appropriate way as a politician, for a Thai audience, he may be dressed in a very westernized way that isn't actually appealing to them. And then layout is considered to be a mode in its own right within multimodal analysis, because reading paths are established with the mode of layout. So the Thai script is written and read from left to right, as English is, as Turkish is. So because of the experience of writing and reading from left to right, it's found that we are more likely to look at an image from left to right, even when there is no writing there, which would of course be different if for an Arabic speaker who is experienced with reading from right to left. However, when you are bilingual, multilingual, you have more than one native languages, of course that kind of becomes complicated further. So these are all thoughts that a multimodal analyst would have, and this is the kind of the first layer, just establishing the modes before thinking about really what are the various intermodal relations going on, and also why are these modes chosen, what kind of, whose interests are being represented by choosing to show Prayut, the Prime Minister, in a fairly interesting pose, perhaps not a very friendly pose here. So why would a sign maker make that choice? Okay, so multimodal analysis is a way to dig deep and be precise when doing textual analysis of any kind. But as I mentioned earlier, like the kind of the mission of critical discourse analysis to unmask ideologies at play within a discourse, it's particularly useful. And intermodal relations as well. So how I gave the brief example of looking at the separate modes of gesture and gaze together in this image. So how different modes work together to make meaning are revealing and can help the analyst account for meaning that might be missed when focusing solely on one mode in isolation, which has typically been the preoccupation with the linguistic mode. That the linguistic mode is the most important and the other modes are supplementary to the linguistic mode. So bearing that in mind, what was the research gap that I recognized, and what is my main research question for my PhD research in relation to that? So some implicit attention has been given to the multimodal nature of Thainess in the primary literature. So some discussions of the significance of statues and architecture, but mainly the preoccupation has been with written texts, so king's speeches, educational textbooks, and the like. And lately, in like the past 2 or 3 years, there has been some greater investment in the multimodality of Thainess. Specifically, Jokun's writing in 2020 dedicated a whole paper to the multimodal construction of Thainess by the Tourism Authority of Thailand. So there is still always a dominant focus on the Thainess discourse produced by the state, so government bodies, state bodies, and that's what I refer to as institutional Thainess. And digital media is also rather neglected as a site for analysing the re- and deconstruction of Thainess, specifically social media like Facebook. So Thainess as multimodally re- and deconstructed by non-state and non-governmental communities, specifically those organising on Facebook, has yet to be researched. And bearing this gap in the literature in mind, I formulated the following research question. How is normative Thainess as discourse multimodally re- and deconstructed by non-state and non-governmental Facebook pages? Okay, so in order to resolve the who aspect of that research question, so to find these non-state / non-governmental communities organizing on Facebook, I had to kind of establish some distance from the norms of the kind of, despite there's plenty of Facebook pages on, there's plenty of communities organizing as Facebook pages that reproduce and redisseminate the institutional Thainess texts. So like very obviously pro-monarchy Facebook pages. So I wanted to establish some distance from that in order to find more anomalies and to see what was really going on with communities that put themselves at a distance from the institutional Thainess norms. So bearing that in mind, I collected data from one independent media Facebook page and one activist Facebook page for 3 culturally distinct Thai regions: the central Bangkokian region, which in general, this central and Bangkokian culture is already being the most represented in institutional Thainess. But as I said, I chose one page, an independent media page and an activist page from that region, and the same for the Izsatt northeastern region, which borders Laos and has its own distinct dialect and very vibrant culture, and the southern Patani region, which is I speak about one of the Facebook pages from this area that I investigated in some more detail today. And in order to respond to the how part of the research question, so how is normative Thainess as discourse multimodally re- and deconstructed? I apply the perspective of social semiotic multimodality to my analysis of a sample of Facebook posts from each of the 6 pages. So as I've kind of tried to shed light on, the thinking behind multimodality is really getting at this how part of the question. With what modes, with what intermodal relations is normative Thainess as discourse constructed? So, in order to help me resolve that research question, I adapted a 2-tier methodology. I wanted to ensure systematism, being very systematic with the data and not cherry picking attractive Facebook posts that seemed right for making my point to resolve the working theories. Of course, there's always the subjectivity of the researcher, and but I wanted to try and have as systematic a methodology as possible. And this led me to the need for a 2-tiered methodology in which the first strand of analysis would generate criteria for sampling in a stable manner and a smaller number of posts for a deeper textual analysis. On the right here is just a screenshot from my data analysis software of my code frame, which from the content analysis that I will discuss in some more detail in a moment. So what I want in strand 1 I conducted an inductive content analysis of collected Facebook posts, and that content analysis generated sampling criteria for the second strand of the methodology. So a fine-grained social semiotic multimodal analysis of a smaller set of sample posts. Now we'll just speak now about the social semiotic aspect of social semiotic multimodal analysis. So social semiotics and multimodality are 2 complementary and kind of co-occurring perspectives on communication and representation, which I'm applying to my analysis. So I've explained in previous slide the thinking behind multimodality, that all communication, where they're embodied, so gaze, gesture, the clothing I decide to wear, my speech, or disembodied, so digitally mediated sign making, print mediated sign making, all communication is always multimodal. Meaning is always constituted by various modes, not just the linguistic that has typically been given primacy, and their interrelations in a given semiotic text or artifact. So Facebook post in this, in multimodal studies would be considered a semiotic text or a semiotic artifact. I refer to, rather than using the term text, because it can be, my Facebook posts have 2 elements, as I'll describe later. So I actually choose not to refer in my research to the the unit of textual analysis as a text, I always refer to it as the Facebook post, but it's considered in the within the perspective of social semiotic multimodality, it's considered a text. Social semiotics complements this perspective and extends it analytically in its understanding that, as Kress and Van Leuven write in this top quote here, and I mentioned earlier, Kress and Van Leuven are like the two kind of founders of social semiotic multimodality that were reacting to the lack of attention given to modes outside of the linguistic mode in discourse analysis. They write that sign makers have a meaning, the signified, which they wish to express, and then express it through the semiotic modes that makes available the subjectively felt, most plausible, most apt form as the signifier. So I'll give like a simple example in terms of institutional Thainess here. A sign, for example, a sign maker wishes to express their love for the monarchy. So one of those three pillars of institutional Thainess, loyalty to and love for the monarchy. A sign maker wishes to express their love for the monarchy in a Facebook post. To do so, they choose the mode of writing to make available what they subjectively feel is the most apt form, i.e. signifier of their love for the monarchy. For example, they may write and publish a simple Facebook post stating, "I love the monarchy," or they may write a more complex post, perhaps a poem expressing their love for the monarchy. A different sign maker might subjectively feel that the most apt form to express their love for the monarchy, the signified, is not writing but an image. Perhaps that specific sign maker subjectively feels that there simply are no words adequate for expressing their love for the monarchy. So they post an image of the royal family instead, along with, for example, several love heart emojis. And emojis are now also considered their own mode, so their own set of resources for making meaning. So due to time restrictions, I'm not going to go into like a huge amount of detail on the specific terminology used in social semiotics, but it suffice to say it's a very rich kind of terminological repertoire which allows the analyst to be really specific in their analysis. I will just read some more quotes from Kress and Van Leuven. This is also to make the point of how social semiotics is resisting the structuralist semiotics or semiology notion of the arbitrary association between form and meaning, or signifier and signified. In social semiotics, the sign is not the pre-existing conjunction of a signifier and a signified, a ready-made sign to be recognized, chosen, and used as it is, in the way that signs are usually thought to be made to be available for use in semiology, unquote. Instead, Kress and Van Leuven write, we see signs as motivated, not arbitrary conjunctions of signifiers, forms, and signifieds, meanings, unquote. And finally, Kress and Van Leuven write, in our view, signs are never arbitrary and motivation should be formulated in relation to the sign maker and the context in which the sign is produced, unquote. So I will now explain what I did in the first strand of my my methodology, which was the inductive content analysis, and I used the data analysis software MaxQDA to do my content analysis, but I'm also able to use it to do the social semiotic multimodal analysis too, to an extent. It's very useful software. I really recommend it for this kind of research. So I imported data into the software from Facebook, from 6 Facebook pages, and that totaled 556 Facebook posts in total. I'll just briefly speak about the rationale behind the time frame used and why I ended up with 556 Facebook posts. I didn't take every Facebook post for a year from each group. That would have resulted in too much data, and I needed to ground the kind of collection process, the data collection process, around my research question as well. So I collected the Facebook posts published by the 6 Facebook pages chosen for the research for the month of October for 2016, 2017, 2018, and 2019. The month of October was chosen due to October 2016 being the month in which the beloved, very, very important King Bhumibol passed away in that month. So it was hypothesized that pro-Thainess, pro-institutional Thainess sentiments would be at their highest during this month, and also in subsequent Octobers when his death would be commemorated, especially since love for and loyalty to the monarchy is one of the pillars of institutional Thainess. So even in groups that may typically establish some distance to the norms of institutional Thainess, it could be hypothesized that they may react to the death of the king in this pro-Thainess manner. So I imported the fight that yielded, following that criteria, it yielded a collection of 556 Facebook posts that were imported into the analysis software, and I inductively coded them all. So, excuse me, rather than creating a frame of categories to assign to the data prior to reading through the data, and by reading I mean obviously reading the written parts of Facebook posts, but also acquainting myself and studying the image components of Facebook posts as well. That would have, if I'd have established a frame of categories prior to that process, that would have been a deductive coding logic, and I didn't want to do that. I instead wanted to let the categories emerge from the data themselves. So even though I had a very specific question about Thainess in mind, because I was aware that Thainess and being Thai could mean many different things other than what we understand it to be through following the norms of institutional Thainess, I wanted to see what would emerge from the data. Although I'm not dealing with interview transcripts, which is usually the data that grounded theorists are handling, and I'm not only dealing with writing, but I'm dealing with images, I coded my data set in a near or equivalent line-by-line approach, as is recommended by grounded theorists. So that's where, for grounded theory analysis of interview transcripts, that's where every line of an interview transcript would be coded with some categories. You would always create a category or assign a category that had already emerged from the inductive analysis to every line of data. So you can kind of see here in the screenshot how that's kind of like a line-by-line approach. So I will discuss how I organize these categories into a more a clearer overarching frame of main codes, but these are all my subcodes of the main codes. I'll show an image in a moment to help that be understandable. So Chalmers, who is a main author in grounded theory, writes that such an approach, so this line by line, very close approach to coding the data, keeps you close to your data without taking off on theoretical flights of fancy, unquote. So rather than kind of having a theory in mind, a theoretical flight of fancy in mind, and finding a way to kind of push that onto the data, the grounded theory approach seeks to kind of stay close and authentic to the data set by seeing what is really there and letting the categories emerge from the data. Okay, so as I mentioned at the start, I will speak about one of the groups, one of the Facebook pages that I investigated in some more detail today. And this is Wartani. This is a screenshot of Wartani's like homepage profile on Facebook here. And you can notice that this is Thai here, but there is also English, Bahasa, and some Arabic, moderated Arabic script. I will discuss the language part in a moment. So the Thai Patani with one T here, Patani with one T, designates the 3 Thai provinces of Patani with 2 T's, transliterated to English with 2 T's, Narathiwat and Yala, plus parts of the province of Songkhla. So Patani with 1 T designates those provinces in the southernmost region of Thailand that borders Malaysia. So they border Malaysia and are home to an ethnic Malay community that has been marginalized by Siam, Thailand, previously Siam, since the 18th century. As bin Abdullah has written, these provinces were first subjugated by the Kingdom of Siam in 1786, while total annexation of Patani began in 1909, and the Anglo-Siamese Treaty of 1909 recognized Siamese sovereignty over Patani, Yala, and Narathiwat, unquote. I should mention that of the 556 posts that were collected following that sampling criteria that I mentioned of collecting posts from the 6 groups in October that were published in October of 2016, 17, 18, and 19, Watani contributed 169 Facebook posts. So the 6 groups did not contribute an equal number of posts because, of course, they have different Facebook practices, different ways of different frequencies with which they publish posts to their Facebook pages. But Watani was the second most prolific contributor to the data set. So I collected 169 Facebook posts for Watani. Some more information now about the Patani region and the history there. In the late 19th century, this is another quote from bin Abdullah, in the late 19th century, the government institutionalized, patronized, and developed a top-down policy of nation building, which emphasized the importance of Thainess, thereby compelling the transformation of the multi-ethnic society of Siam into a unified Thai nation. And this process continued well into the 20th century and is ongoing. The dictatorial leader, Pibun, who was responsible for the name change of Siam to Thailand in 1939, issued a number of cultural orders in 1939, the same year, and some of those banned Muslim cultural and religious practices, and also the use of the Malay language. So Muslim religious and cultural identity and Muslim Malay religious and cultural identity is viewed as problematic by the Thai state and going against Buddhist norms. And obviously Buddhism is one of the pillars of institutional Thainess. And also Patani, the Patani community is linguistically subversive to the central Thai dialect. So Bahasa Patani is spoken in the area, and that is like a Romanized, that can be Romanized as it is here, or it can be written as Yawi in a modified Arabic script. So there's been so much pushback from the Thai state to not allow signage in the Patani area in Yawi, and for school children to learn Thai and to kind of neglect Yawi. So the Patani community is inherently disruptive of Thai nationalism at large, resistant to being part of the Thai state. There is a lot of separatist sentiments in Patani, and as such, the norms of institutional Thainess. So this was a very interesting Facebook page to study, bearing in mind the specific subversions to the norms of institutional Thainess that arise in this region compared to other regions which are predominantly Buddhist and speak perhaps like a dialect of Thai, but still in the Thai script. Okay, I'll just quickly discuss something about how I analyzed the Facebook posts. So I separated the Facebook posts from my data set into 2 components in order to do the coding in the software and create two separate code frames. So on the left is what I call the image component, and the image component, I'm submitting my thesis next year, so this is still some, I'm working through the terminology that I will use for this, because it's kind of problematic to call this image component an image component when the image can contain writing, or it could be an uploaded photograph of just writing, for example. So I'm thinking of some better wording for this, but just for now, the image component in the red square, I'm calling it the image component, or the IC, and then the written component, so the typed in aspect of the Facebook post, is known as the WC. So every Facebook post in my large data set contained both a written component and an image component. Of course, you can upload just an image to Facebook, or just writing to Facebook, but in order to kind of enhance the multimodal aspect of the posts, considering the research that I'm doing, I made that some criteria for the data collection process too. So every post that was collected contained this written component and the image component. So this is a chart of the code designations for the Watani written component. So in the yellow square here. So the main code names along the side here, this is just specific to Watani's written components, and showing the distribution of the main codes across those written components for Watani. These main code names gather various subcodes within them. So you can see religion here in the middle. It opens up and it has these various subcodes. So they are kind of names to designate themes of the subcodes, and the subcodes are more specific. So specific linguistic references to Islam, for example. So bearing the subversive nature of the Patani community in mind towards the norms of Thainess, as I just outlined, I suspected that the content analysis, so I hypothesized that the content analysis of the Watani Facebook posts would reveal that the three pillars of Thainess, institutional Thainess, so nation, religion, by which is meant Buddhism, and king, may be either unrepresented or underrepresented, or represented in a disruptive manner. And as we can see in the chart, the most frequent category designation for the written components was place and regional identity. So the subcodes under this main code of place and regional identity emerged from the content analysis, so emerged in that inductive manner from the large data set to differentiate linguistic material that specified places and regional cultural identities that concur with said places, from references simply to Thailand or the Thai nation or the Thai people. And 70.3% of Facebook posts collected from Watani contained linguistic references specifically to the contested Patani region, while only 14.5% contained linguistic reference to the Thai nation. So this reveals how the Watani page uses the mode of writing on Facebook to regionalize and localize and heterogenize identity discourses, as opposed to adhering to and reproducing the centralizing norm of institutional Thainess, in which the Thai nation and the Thai people take center stage. And as previously mentioned, you can see at the bottom of the chart here, so the least frequent category designations for the written components of Watani's posts came from the monarchy and nobility main code. So one of the most stable and enduring and sort of untouchable pillars of institutional Thainess is the monarchy. So the Facebook content from Watani clearly flouts the norm there. It's the least common category designation. and only 7.7 of Watani's Facebook posts contain any linguistic reference to or representation of the monarchy. And in the middle here, pretty much in the middle of the chart, is religion. So religion is a central pillar of institutional Thainess. So, and it's fairly well represented in Watani's Facebook posts. However, if we take a look at the subcodes making up the religion parent code, it becomes clear that Watani, whilst giving fair representation to religion, is subversive of the dominance of Buddhism, and that Islam is given more representation through the linguistic mode in Watani's Facebook posts. So this resists the marginalization of Muslim Malay culture by the Thai state, who, as bin Abdullah has writes, banned many Muslim religious practices as well as the use of the Malay language, and used force and discriminative policies in order to coerce the Patani people into changing their ethnic and cultural identity and to conform to that of central Thainess, unquote. So there is some representation of Thai Buddhism here. You can see 10.2% of the Watani written components of the Facebook posts contain some linguistic reference to or representation of Thai Buddhism, but Islam is more represented. So the subcode Islam would designate linguistic references such as the word Islam, or linguistic references to the Quran, linguistic references to a mosque, for example. And this was a particular finding for this group, this page. So the other Facebook pages, well, from the other regions, the 2 Facebook pages from the Isan northeastern region and the 2 Facebook pages from the central Bangkok region did not represent Islam in this manner. So we can really see how Watani's Facebook content is giving some representation to Islam that does not usually find its place in Thai digital semiotic texts. Now, I also, as I mentioned, I separated the coding process out into the coding the image component on the left and on the written component on the right. So I've just spoken about the written component there. I won't go into as much detail with the codes of the code, the specific main code designations for the image component of Watani's post, because I will talk about this top one here, the image type. So you can see on this chart, it's come up with 100% coverage. So I needed to establish stable criteria for sampling a selection of posts for the second strand of analysis, the social semiotic multimodal analysis. So I had 556 Facebook posts because of the very detailed, pedantic nature of social semiotic multimodal analysis. I was never going to be able to do that on 556 Facebook posts, but I also didn't just want to do that on Facebook posts that looked interesting or were appealing for analysis. So I needed to find some stable criteria for sampling. And the image type category offered the most stable criteria for sampling because it was the only category assigned to every single post in the data set. So you can see every 100% of Watani's image components and as part of the Facebook posts, therefore 100% of Watani's posts were designated with a category from the image type main code. And that's because of what I mentioned earlier, that I selected Facebook posts that had both an image and some writing uploaded. So that was the criteria that I chose to then sample some posts for the second strand of analysis. So for each of the 6 Facebook pages, the post with the most likes or comments, like the combination of likes, comments, and shares for each image type category was selected for the second strand of analysis. So The different image type categories that emerged were, the most common one here for the whole data set was photographs with graphics and or writing. So the image would contain some a photograph and then some graphical or written element as well. In the second place here, it's photographs with no graphics or writing, so just the photograph was uploaded as part of the post, and then also the written component in that second separate component that I differentiate. Third, copies and screenshots, so where it was obvious that one of the uploaded image had been screenshotted from another website because of the some writing on there that indicated that it wasn't original to the Facebook page being investigated. Fourth, graphics, illustrations, no photographs. So any images that just contained graphical or illustrative elements and no photographic element. In fifth, black and white. And now I will speak in a moment about why the black and white color scheme is significant to institutional Thainess for the context of the data collection process. So it seemed apt and suitable to allow any posts that were any images that were black and white to have their own image type category. And finally, infographics. So for each of the 6 Facebook pages, the post with the most likes, comments, and shares for each image type category was selected for the second strand of analysis. And following this sampling criteria, a total of 22 Facebook posts from the dataset was selected for the detailed social semiotic multimodal analysis in the second strand of the methodology. So one of the posts that was sampled for Watani following this criteria is this one here. So today I'm just going to discuss the image component of this post. So it's uploaded with writing, it's published with writing in the written component on Facebook, but just for the sake of time, I will discuss the image component today. So this post was published to the Watani Facebook page on the 31st of October 2017. It had a total of 1,547 likes, comments, and shares. So in this second strand, the fine-grained, detailed social semiotic multimodal analysis, what do I do? What does the analyst do in this stage? Beginning by establishing what modes are deployed in the text being analyzed. So in this image, we have an image. So what type of image is it? Is it a photograph or is it illustrative and sketch-like? So this one is clearly not a photograph. It's more illustrative. It's kind of like a sketch, but it's also still quite naturalistic, like a photograph would be. And it offers a represented participant, a male participant. So because we have a human participant there, we can also establish some embodied modes of representation and communication. So these embodied modes like gaze, posture, and the clothing that the represented participant is wearing. So if it had been a photograph or an illustrative sketch-like representation of a car, we wouldn't then be looking at these other embodied modes of semiotic modes. But because it's a human participant, we can establish those as well. So the gaze is kind of difficult to establish whether the gaze is looking directly at the lens or the viewer or just off, but it's quite a mild, perhaps a little bit concerned gaze, but it's not confrontational. And the posture, it's difficult to establish the participant's posture because of the kind of effects that have been used. So the multimodal analyst would query that. We can't actually make out the whole frame because of the type of effects or the type of sketching that has been deployed. The clothing, it's clearly it's representing the traditional Muslim Malay clothing, so that's significant, especially when taken in intermodal relation with the writing. So I'll just briefly discuss here something that is important for the social semiotic aspect of multimodal analysis, which is querying meaning potential and how the deployment of a mode in a text how it has its meaning potential. Where does it get that meaning potential from? So the graphics here, kind of the appearance of torn edges and the way that there's a paint-like substance, as well as the kind of black and white or sepia filter color scheme there, is suggestive of authenticity. So from our experience of these kind of combinations, perhaps with looking at an old document or an old photograph, we can establish a meaning potential from that. So old documents and photographs, perhaps they seem to be authentic. They might be quite seem to hold quite a lot of knowledge, and that could be reflected on the represented participant here as being someone that's wise. So these are all avenues that you would go down when doing the multimodal analysis. Layout, I won't go into loads of detail now, just conscious of time, and we'll try to speed up a bit. As I mentioned, layout is its own mode because meaning can be made from that mode. And now sorry, I'm just moving the screen a little bit. The writing, the mode of writing we see here. So in Thai, it says Chiwit Tek Pono, which translates to the life of a pondok. Pondok is the Bahasa Malay word, pondok, but it's been, how it's read in Thai, how it's transliterated in Thai is pronounced slightly differently without the harsh ending. So Ponok, the life of a pondok, which means madrasa, kid. So the life of a kid that goes to a madrasa school. And in the at the bottom right here, the linguistic mode is used to say a poem by Puchai Rimtang. So that's the pen name here, Wayside Boy. So it's introducing what is a poem entitled The Life of a Madrasa Kid in the written component here, which I can't discuss in detail today. But and then the color scheme is a kind of black and white or sepia color scheme. So it's very dull, and as I mentioned a moment ago, we have some associations with that of something being aged, something being wise, something being authentic. But it also, that there's a lot to talk about. So I won't go into more detail. I want to discuss what the next stage of the multimodal analysis would be. So after establishing all the modes present and deployed in a text, the multimodal analyst then goes on to query the significance of specific intermodal relations. So for the sake of time today, I can just discuss the intermodal relations between writing and color. But when you're doing it, maybe it will become clear why I had to sample a smaller number of texts, because you would query every intermodal relation and go deeper and deeper, because it's that kind of querying the intermodal relations that allow the ideological underpinnings to kind of come out. So what could be seen as simply an image of a Patani man and some writing introducing a poem, when we go deep with different intermodal relations. So what does it mean that the represented participant is on the left here and the writing is on the right? What does that mean in combination with the choice of the black and white sepia color scheme and so on? But today I will just discuss the intermodal relation of writing and color. So the black and white color scheme, sepia color scheme seen here, is something that can be attributed to mourning, specifically within the Thai digital context at the time this post was published in October 2017. Many Thai websites and Facebook pages, along with other social media accounts, were choosing to change their content to black and white or sepia or dull colors in order to express mourning and commemoration of the beloved King Bhumibol, who passed away in October 2016. So that was a practice that was established immediately after his death in October 2016, but it carried through. There were these digitally mediated practices of mourning were still happening a year later in October 2017. This time, perhaps not as the immediate act of mourning and as a reaction to grief, but in order to commemorate the king. This was also something that was happening with embodied modal choices. So people were wearing clothes, and there was a lot of anger in Thai society when people were choosing not to wear mourning, even for several weeks following the king's death, or in the subsequent months of commemorating his death. So the choice of a black and white or sepia predominant color scheme of this post must be considered within this context. So this is something that the social semiotic aspect of multimodal analysis is very puts a lot of emphasis on the context. So this disrupts perhaps the immediate experiential meaning potential we can make from these color choices, as what I mentioned a moment ago. It's we think of this kind of coloring when it comes to old documents, old discolored photographs, bringing up feelings of authenticity. Instead, this takes on quite a nuanced, direct meaning in the Thai context for these digital practices of mourning. However, if we think about this color choice in combination with the writing, which introduces the content of the post-written component, a poem about life for children in Patani that attend madrasas or pondoks. So the poem's title, The Life of a Madrasa Kid, is problematic and made difficult by the Thai state. So the Compulsory Primary Education Act of 1921 required, this is a quote from Bin Abdullah again, required all Thais, including Malay Muslim children, to attend Thai primary school for 4 years in order to learn the Thai language, which included the inculcation of Buddhist ethics. The Thai state focused on removing the Muslim religious schools. So, yeah, so a multimodal analysis of the intermodal relations between color and writing in the image would query whether the choice of the black and white or sepia color scheme adheres to the normative contextual usage to express mourning and commemoration of King Bhumipon's death, or rather taken in intermodal relation with the writing, which introduces a poem about the life of a madrasa kid, might it instead express mourning over the loss of an integral part of the Patani way of life, so the Pondok schooling system. And then the social semiotic layer of analysis would go further and extend this question to query who, for what reasons, and to serve whose interests certain signifiers are chosen in favor of others. And something useful in resolving these questions from the social semiotic aspect of the analysis is what is called a commutation test. So considering how meaning would be made differently in a given text that's being analyzed if you change the modal choice. So how would this post is quite melancholic feeling, this image. So, and that makes sense when we consider the subject of the poem, which is about an integral way of Patani Muslim Malay life that is being oppressed by the Thai state. But if the image here was very colorful, that melancholic feeling would be lost. So that's called a commutation test, when the analyst tries to kind of play with the semiotic design of the text in order to understand the design of the text better. So it's disruptive of the norms of institutional Thainess when we consider the subversive use of this black and white sepia dull color scheme, which was contextually and typically used to signify love for the monarchy through expressing mourning of the death of King Bhumipon, implied by and when taken in intermodal relation with the assertion of the Pondok culture, which is disruptive of the Buddhist pillar of institutional Thainess in the mode of writing. Okay, I have run over a little bit, but so now I hope it's kind of shed some light on my methodology and how I approach like textual analysis and how I see how multimodality can be useful for uncovering like discourses and ideologies in a given text or collection of texts. My research that I have begun at KUASIA will apply this same methodology, and I have already started applying this methodology to the research question of how are street animals multimodally represented in Istanbul versus Bangkok. This may be extended to Turkey versus Thailand in the future if I'm successful with my postdoc plans and proposals and such. With the the concurrent research question of what discourses regarding the street animal phenomena in both cities are being multimodally represented. So these three images are images that I have taken. So I've started to build up a data set now from things that I come across around the city. So it's been quite an interesting experience being able to collect data in a very on the ground, informal manner whenever I see something interesting, which will be something I'll need to approach from the idea of being a reflexive researcher, but it's totally different to the way that I was collecting my Facebook data, screenshotting, copying and pasting the text, the written aspect into the data set. So the data set that I'm building up now is any governmental Belediye municipality level signage text, semiotic text that I'm seeing around the city. Also any texts that about street animals, representing street animals in some way. Also, on the other hand, any non-governmental, non-state interventions in that representation. So the photograph in the middle here is from a coffee shop in Beşiktaş. So I'm collecting these, importing them into the same data analysis software. Because of my level of Turkish at the minute, it's quite, although I'm getting some help with this from friends, but it's quite kind of sketching the content analysis at the minute. But because of the nature of these texts, they tend to have quite simplified Turkish, the ones that I'm coming across on the street. But in the long term, I will want to consult NGO websites, perhaps even legal texts on animals. So my immediate plans after submitting my thesis in April next year are to do an intensive Turkish course and hopefully go forward with this project as far as I can. So thank you very much. That's the end of my talk.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. So now we have some time for questions and comments, and we are basically turning on the microphones. People can ask questions directly. I actually have two questions.
Yeah.
So one is, so your sample. So my first question is about your sample. So you talked about 6 different Facebook pages. Am I right?
Yeah.
So this Wartani is one of them.
Yes.
What about the others? And basically, when of course you're presenting the Wartani case, you're talking about the Thai Muslim identity, right?
Yeah.
But what about other identities that may shape the understanding of Thainess? So what kind of findings do you have?
Yeah. So the other 5 groups, there was another group page from this same region, but it was an activist page. So I took one independent media page. So Wartani is an independent media page reporting on the ground from the Patani region, and then one grassroots activist page for each of the 3 regions that I looked at. So Free Voice was the activist group for the Patani region. It wasn't particularly prolific in terms of the data that it contributed to the large data set, but it was again representing the Muslim Malay identity in a similar manner to Wartani. For the central Bangkok region, the The independent media page that I looked at is called Thailand Record, and it kind of it disrupts the Thainess norms in some ways, but the analysis has shown how it's got some quite like habituated norms going on there, perhaps because it is a group from the center, whose interests are generally being represented through institutional Thainess more anyway. One of the interesting findings was how the kind of experts were put at the forefront of giving voice to Thai people. So it still wasn't really letting Thai citizens be represented. It was like experts in the sense of politicians, academics. So that compared to, if I just go back here, I didn't speak about this today, but compared to Watani, in its image components, it was, other than the image type, which I used for sampling, the most common designation was people. So a lot of the images showed many people from the community. It wasn't putting experts or academics or politicians center stage. It was just the common people who, so very citizen focused representations in the images. And the activist group from the central region, Education for the, I've got them listed here at the bottom actually. These are the Facebook names, and they're all findable in the English like that on Facebook. Education for the Liberation of Siam. So how school children are treated is their kind of main issue, and how one of the interesting findings from the multimodal analysis of this group is how affected the Thai youth is by uniform and uniform haircuts. There was recently, last week, Dove, the skincare brand, produced an advert, a kind of campaign video about how Thai school children shouldn't be forced to have specific haircuts. So the kind of unifying capacity of school uniforms, also particular haircuts, is something that group really takes issue with. And it kind of it feeds into this idea of how to homogenize Thai citizens effectively along the lines of institutional Thainess. Then finally, the Izsatt Record, it's the independent media group from the Izsatt northeastern region, and the New Izsatt Movement is the activist group from that region. The findings there were very interesting because they were very environmental focused. So a lot of images and very protest oriented. So a lot of the images from both of those groups were images of protests. Something I found interesting from that was how rather than having the Thai flag represented in these images, there were kind of homemade flags and protest banners being shown there, and still a very prominent Buddhist element for those groups though. So a lot of the protest imagery was like big group photographs of protests taking place in front of a Buddhist temple, for example. I think, did I answer both of the questions there?
Yeah, I have one more
Sure.
question. So for all these, Facebook pages, is there an editorial process there, or you are collecting both some, editorially processed posts and some, follower comments? Like, what are these posts actually,
Yeah, I'm not collecting any interventions from followers, so any comments or anything like that. I'm not looking at the reception of the text. I'm just looking at the texts as they were published by the group, by the page itself. So in terms of social semiotic multimodal analysis, I consider the sign makers in my analysis, for my unit of analysis, the Facebook post, to be either a collective or an individual behind as a kind of content writer for these pages. So generally, they are either original posts, so like original writing to the group, or they have been quoted from another Facebook page or another source, in which case the group is like citing that source. So as I mentioned, the independent media group that I looked at for the central Bangkok region, the Thailand record, is really focused on this expert discourse. So a lot of the posts from them quote other Facebook posts from these experts. So Thais are really quite attached to Facebook still. I mean, my project, I started in 2016 because I'm a part-time PhD student. So in the course of these years, I have noticed like a big uptake of Twitter that wasn't there when I started my project, but Facebook is still somewhere where like an academic, I think I've noticed in Turkish culture, like the academic culture takes place on Twitter quite significantly, but for Thailand, it's still Facebook. So there's these kind of like popular academics that have big Facebook followings. Like one of the Facebook posts that have been sampled for the Thailand record Facebook page is it appropriates and recontextualizes some of the content of a Facebook post coming from a very popular Thai academic who has like over 1 million people following him on his Facebook page. So there's quite a lot of interesting intertextual stuff going on as well.
Okay, so we have here, I'm seeing two participants having questions. First, Zeynep Ceren Ertürk.
First of all, thank you very much for this really interesting presentation. My question is that how do you counter the challenges while interpreting the images or the posts when you feel like you don't really have, let's say, the position to interpret according to the social or political aspects that you might just not be that much aware of, as it's impossible to follow up with everything. Does this multimodal observation help all the time, or do you feel like you should, for each post, do further investigation or some other research, because it sounds like having that much of Facebook posts to discover and to interpret, it must be quite difficult to have that, to possess that knowledge. And although it sounds really interesting to do the multimodal interpretation, I just wondered how you countered those kind of challenges.
Okay, thank you, Zeynep. We have one more question and you'll answer both.
Okay.
Rebecca. Ingrid Salvadori.
Yes, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
It was really an interesting presentation. Actually, I have a question that is more about Facebook. Have you faced any censorship? Like, have you found any censorship of Facebook in the post that you analyzed or in the pages, or any other like edits made by Facebook?
Yeah, I will quickly answer that question and then Zeynep's question. In the main data set of 556 Facebook posts that I collected, I only encountered this Facebook level intervention and censorship, which wasn't full censorship. It was kind of like a shield when one of the images that was uploaded and published as part of one of the Facebook posts was quite graphic. So there was an incident in 1976 when there was kind of a mass protest on a Thai campus that resulted in a lot of deaths of students. So there was an image from that scene, and Facebook, I mean, if I had a screenshot I could show you, but it like it's probably changed now as well, the kind of formatting of this warning, but it says like, this is a warning, basically, this image is graphic, do you want to open it? That was the only like Facebook level intervention that I was aware of where anything had been censored or changed. It's just one instance in the whole data set. To answer Zeynep's question, so in the I guess it depends on the scope of the project. I had two strands of the methodology. So I imported 556 Facebook posts into my data analysis software to do the content analysis on. And then I sampled 22 of those posts. And within the bounds of a PhD thesis, I have the kind of the time and the space to analyze those 22 posts through multimodal social semiotic analysis avenues. I guess I have been studying like Thai language and culture since 2010. So some of the contextual stuff, although like definitely not everything, is kind of something I'm acquainted with anyway, but absolutely, like I had to cap my kind of my pedantic, the level of being pedantic at like the content analysis was, it didn't require a lot of like going outside of the data set to uncover things. When there was some confusion, for example, like Thai phrases that I hadn't come across before, and I was seeing like a few of the different groups using these phrases, and it turned out to be one way of referring to a particular politician as a kind of nickname, for example. This kind of thing, I had to go and probe that further, but this need to really do the extra contextual work only comes in with the multimodal analysis. But one thing that Cress, one of the founders of this field of social semiotics and multimodality, would say that although you cannot always, and you never can be sure of the intention behind the sign making process, any kind of meaning that you as a meaning maker, so if you're analyzing a text, you're considered to be a meaning maker, you're making meaning from that text, any meaning you have arrived at was opened up to you by the text in the first place. So it's really trying to probe that aspect more than any establishing any intention behind it. I didn't speak about this notion today in the presentation, but a very important concept in social semiotics is the idea of interest. So interest, the sign maker's interest, which is informed by their like social positioning, their psychosocial histories, things like this. That interest, the sign maker interest, is what informs the motivated choice between form and meaning, signifier and signified. So rather than kind of making suggestions about sign maker intention, we can make estimates about sign maker interest and the motivated association between form and signifier. So I can suggest that the reason, and I can query the interest that would lead to choosing one signifier over another. And also, you know, platforms like Facebook, they limit our sign making our capacity somewhat. So on Facebook, even the Facebook post itself, so much more can be done with the image component, because a sign maker could write anything on a piece of paper, draw anything, and upload that as the image. But in the written part of a Facebook post, we can't do that much. We can't easily, we don't have the options. I think anyone that's good at coding, which I'm not, might be able to change the color of the writing. We don't have a lot of options for what comes up when you view the Facebook post in this opened up manner like this. So when you are uploading an image and writing together. So there are some platform level interventions as well that are significant. For example, like the character, sorry, I'm trying to go back to this one. The character count on Twitter, that is limiting the sign maker's choice somewhat, but also Twitter opens up possibilities for sign making in a way that in ways that Facebook doesn't, and then that's the same for Instagram. It's the same for WhatsApp and so on.
Thank you. Any other questions? We are actually reaching our time sort of limit. Okay, then, so I would like to thank all participants for their interesting questions, and of course you, Rebecca, for this excellent presentation.
Thank you. Thank you everyone that attended as well.